Yeah, we're like 2 minutes early, but we're gonna run out of time. So, um, okay, tonight we're gonna look at Judges chapter 2 and like half the beginning part of chapter 3. The introduction to Judges we mentioned before really goes from like chapter 1 all the way to chapter 3, verse 6 or verse 7. And if you try to go through and you try to trace out the chronology of the book of Judges, you're going to be very frustrated because the author does not start at the beginning and go straight through to the end. He jumps around, and some of the events in the book are happening simultaneously, and there are other books that are happening simultaneously, like Ruth fits somewhere in the midst of all this. Many people like to put Ruth in about the time of Samson, and the writer, I don't know if that's where that book goes or not. Um, whoever's writing this, putting it together, presents the information thematically rather than chronologically. So you're going to have some pairs of judges that correspond to one another. You're going to have several very similar situations. You're going to have Israel doing some of the same things repeatedly, and it's just this image of the people continually getting worse and worse and worse. And so if you read through and it seems like things are out of order, you're right, they are. And it's out of order on purpose because the way the book is written is not like we would write a modern history. It just jumps all over the place. It's one, to me personally, that's one of the more frustrating things about reading the Hebrew writers is they don't start at the beginning and end at the end, right? They're kind of all over. And so if you're like me, then it's going to frustrate you too. But we just have to understand that the reason why the book is written that way is to take you through this progression from where the people were supposed to have been to where the people wound up. And there are events that the writer is going to leave out on purpose. There are things that are happening that we don't get because they don't fit into the story that you're being told about the judges. It doesn't mean that things are missing, just like at the end of John's gospel, John will say, if everything that he did was written in the book, I mean, the world couldn't hold all of the information. Sort of the same thing. So what you're getting is chosen specifically to tell you a certain story about the people of Israel. And it starts, like we mentioned before, very close to God. We start with Judah. We end up with Dan in the first chapter where we're going through and looking at all the people, what they're conquering, and what they're doing. And it's getting worse and worse in there. And when we start with the judges, we're going to begin with Othniel from Judah, and we will end with Samson from Dan. And so you're going to see the same repetition. And then you're going to see it one more time at the end of the book. You're going to see this starting close to God, ending up far away from God. The book starts off with the dismemberment of that Canaanite king, and the book ends with the dismemberment of an Israelite woman. And so there's all these things that you're going to see that repeat themselves in the text. And by the time you get to the end of the book, your conclusion, I hope, will be the same as mine, that these people were really messed up. And they were not at all who God wanted them to be. And that's part of what we're supposed to see. And there are other lessons that we'll pick up as we go throughout the text. But remember, this is sort of like the antithesis from what we're doing the rest of the year. On Sunday mornings, when we're looking at 1 Peter, and what we're doing when we're together in our worship service, we're looking at the opposite of that now. This is what happens when people move away from God, and we want to be those who move towards God. So we're going to start in chapter 2, and we're just going to read the first few verses there and then look at what's going on. So in chapter 2 and verse 1, it says, the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochim, and he said, I've brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you, and you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods will become a snare to you. As soon as the angel of the Lord spoke these words to all the people of Israel, the people lifted up their voices and wept, and they called the name of that place Bochim, and they sacrificed there to the Lord. Okay, so what's going on? This is sort of the conclusion to the stuff that we've read. We're going to start off with Joshua again in verse 6 in just a minute. But how does the conquest of the land get summarized for us here? Yeah. Yes. They failed. They didn't do what God said. They were supposed to drive the people out. They're supposed to tear down all the altars. They're supposed to destroy all the false gods. And one of the reasons, I had a friend from India, and when you tried to get him to talk about religion in India, he would never say the names of the gods. And one of the reasons why he wouldn't is because when you get to the Old Testament, the Israelites are not even supposed to name the gods of the other nations. And one of the reasons why is because words like Baal or Molech or any of those other names that we see, we're like, wow, that's a foreign god. In the ancient world, that just meant God. And there, like we mentioned before, I think there are carvings where the Israelites will refer to Jehovah as Baal or Baal, and other nations will refer to their gods as Jehovah. And so these names become interchangeable, and the Israelites had to be very careful, living in the society that was very, very diverse as far as the number of gods are concerned. Almost all of them are polytheistic. Going into this, they had to guard very carefully the idea that there is one God, and that all of these other gods are not. Whatever they happen to be, they are not the one true living God. And so that God entered into a covenant with these people, and they were supposed to drive the people out, tear these altars down, just basically get rid of all these false ideas, these false idols, and they don't. And God's response is, you've broken the covenant. I made a covenant with you, and I said I was never going to break it, and then I brought you into the land, and you broke it. You broke the covenant. You have not obeyed my voice. And one of the things I have to remind myself when I read the Old Testament is when God says stuff like that, you haven't obeyed my voice, it wasn't like a one-time thing. It's not like one of the Israelites somewhere over in a back corner, did something wrong, and he's like, oh, the whole nation is unfaithful. I mean, this is a continuous thing. It's the people as a whole, the culture as a whole, and it's a repeated offense. It's not a one-time thing. And when you go in what we read earlier, you have everybody falling into this accusation. So why is it, what does God say he's going to do with those nations that are not being driven out now? Yeah, he's not going to drive them out for him. Yeah, it's going to be a constant irritation from now on. In Texas, we don't say thorn in your side, we say burr under the saddle. Right? Same idea, right? It's something that's going to constantly be a pain. It's going to bother you the entire time. A rock in your shoe. Have you ever had that? A snake in your boot? No, that's from Toy Story. This idea that you've got something that is going to constantly be wearing on you, and it's going to aggravate you, and it's never going to go away. That's now what these people are going to be. And that sort of sets the backdrop for whatever Paul's thorn in the flesh is over in the New Testament. It's the same sort of thing where there's going to be this constant aggravation from something in Paul's past, very likely. So here they go. They were disobedient, and now God is going to leave something, and the thing that is being left is going to be a thorn in their side and a snare to them. Why do you think he describes the gods as a snare? Yeah. Yeah, it sneaks up on them, it traps them, and it draws them in. And the harder you pull to get away sometimes, the tighter it squeezes around you. That's why animals don't ever get out of snares, because their instinct when they get snared is to run. And if you tied your snare right, the more they run, the tighter it gets. And so that's sort of the picture. Now they're in a situation where they are not going to be able to use their own strength to fix the problem. It's going to get worse. Okay, so the response of the people is to lift up their voices and weep. Is that good? Yeah, I mean, I think it's good. And then you kind of get, right, you're going to get this, like the throwback in verse 6. We didn't read it yet, but you get this toss back to the time when the people are faithful. This is a good response. God comes to the people and he says, you violated the covenant. I'm not going to do the things that I said because you didn't do what you said. Right? I was going to drive these nations out in front of you, but now I'm not going to. And it's not like this was a surprise. Right? This is a discussion that God had had with these people. And he tells them in Deuteronomy, he gives them curses and blessings. In Leviticus, there are curses and blessings. And again, it's not like God is waiting for the people to make one mistake so he can lob all the curses down on top of them. He's very patient. He's very gracious. But when the people just refuse to be his people, God doesn't give them the blessings that they were going to get as his children. And so that's where they're going to find themselves now. They know what the curses are. They know what the result is going to be of not serving God, and they have this godly sorrow. They weep, and they name that place for their weeping, for this message that they've gotten from the angel of the Lord. Now, they don't only weep. What else do? They sacrifice. They worship God. Sometimes we forget that yeah, when we are in this process of repentance, there is this sorrow that we feel, but the turning to God also includes worship, coming back to him, praising him for who he is, for his grace, for his mercy, and that's the response. Whether God is promising to fulfill the covenant with the blessings or the curses, blessed be the name of the Lord. It's sort of reminiscent of maybe Job. You know, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. He's wrong about what happened to him, but that attitude is very right. You know, no matter what, God is to be worshipped. Because God doesn't change. The nature, the person of God doesn't change based off of our obedience. He's always the same. Yes?
It seems like their lack of discipline and ability to honor God and know what God stands for is the problem, because in the first chapter he says, here's the land, take it, fight the Canaanites, and they, instead of doing it half willingly, they have another tribe helping them accomplishing the same thing. God let them have the land. But it seems like it's, like you said, it's repetitious. It's just simply a lack of discipline when they felt we could do whatever we want. Whatever is right, we could do it. And it was just no discipline whatsoever. And it's unfortunately going to be repetitious over and over and over.
Yeah. And they're going to wind up, because through that repetition, they are going to become the people that were supposed to be driven out. I won't read through Leviticus 18 for you, but if you want to, you can look at the end of Leviticus 18 and verses 24 through 30 at the end of this just list of things that God tells the Israelites, don't do this, don't do this, don't do that. There's just this list of things. And you read through the list, you think to yourself, who needs this list? Who needs somebody to sit down and tell them, don't do all the stuff in this list? Well, they did. The Corinthians did. And we do, to some extent. And the reason why all of our cultures need this is because without God, there really is no direction. Right? We are unable to figure out what is true and what is right unless God shows us. And so that includes things that we might consider to be basic. And the reason why we consider them to be basic is because Christianity has been a very powerful force in the Western world, at least, for close to 2,000 years. And so we cheat. Right? We're not very much like these ancient cultures where all of those things were okay. So God comes in and he says, these people, starting verse 24, the land is vomiting out these people because they've done all these things. And if you do all these things, the land is going to vomit you out also. And so by the end of the book, the Israelites are almost indistinguishable from those Canaanite nations. They're doing all the things that are listed in that passage. There are other places, Deuteronomy, where you're going to have the blessings and the curses. It's not good. And this theme of Israel becoming the Canaanites is going to be repeated throughout the text of Scripture in a variety of different ways. For example, in Revelation chapter 11 and verse 8, John refers to Jerusalem as Sodom and Egypt. He doesn't actually say Jerusalem. He says the city where your Lord was crucified. And he calls it Sodom and Egypt. Why would he call Jerusalem Sodom and Egypt? He's got a map. He knows where those places are. Yeah, it's who they'd become. Throughout Genesis and Exodus, right, they're the bad guys, and especially in Exodus. And now in Revelation, to call Jerusalem Egypt is to say, you who were supposed to be the people of God, you are now the bad guys. You are Egypt. Or the 5 cities of the plain in Genesis are destroyed with fire from heaven. And to call Jerusalem Sodom is to basically say, you are those people on the plain, worthy of destruction. And now what you're going to see in the book of Judges is just like God said the land is going to vomit out these Canaanite tribes. By the end of the book, the Israelites are just another Canaanite tribe. I mean, not by lineage, but that's who they became. And so this call, repeated throughout the Old Testament, come out from among them and be holy, is one that is significant. And it resonates with God's people throughout time, because no matter where you are always coming out of Egypt. You are always coming out of Babylon. You're coming out of whatever nation you were in. And at times, we mistake the nation that we're in for the country where we're supposed to be headed. And we have to be really careful that as great as things are where we happen to live, this is not the nation of which we are citizens. And our citizenship is in heaven. And that call to come out from among them resonates even yet today. And we especially, I would think, in our situation, the very real danger is that the step from who we ought to be into becoming just like the culture around us is an even smaller step. At least the first one, because our culture is so close, right? It's so close to what we ought to be. Yeah, it doesn't take long. It just takes one generation to not teach, or one generation to not learn. Right? It's probably a little bit of blame on both ends there in the story, but that's exactly what you're going to see. Yes. I don't remember the guy's name, but I was listening to the radio when I was in high school. Do people still listen to the radio? Maybe some people do. Anyway, so I was listening to the radio when I was in high school, and there was a political commentator, and he had a guest on, and I remember the guest yelling at the guy and saying, you know, you're too far to the right. You're too far to the right. And I remember the radio host going, whoa, no. I'm in the middle of the road. The problem isn't that I'm too far to the right. The problem is that you're moving the road. And so what used to be in the middle now seems to be a far right position, to use our political commentary. But that's what happens. The reference point moves. And as the reference point moves, the appearance is that you're where you're supposed to be. And so that's what happens over time when you're not making God known. When you're not making that, like in Deuteronomy 6, when you're not rising up and going throughout the day and laying down in the evening with the word of God or the word about God on your mouth, the reference point moves. And when you start looking at the Canaanite nations, well, I mean, in chapter 1, when they're dismembering that Canaanite king, well, you look at the nations around you, I mean, this is just one guy. It's really not that big of a deal. And you just constantly move the reference point. And that's what happens throughout those judge cycles, is every time the reset isn't all the way back where it's supposed to be. And so the movement continues until you get to the end, and Israel is just another Canaanite nation. And it doesn't take long. Any other thoughts before we move to verse 6 and following? Even in the punishment, you're exactly right. And in parenting, like the Bible is the one that draws that analogy. It's not a perfect analogy, but the Bible is the one that draws that analogy of God being the father, we being the children. If you ever tell your child that you're going to punish them if they do something, and then they do that thing, what had you better do? You better punish them, right? And in our house, that's a problem for me, especially with the little girls. Because there'll be something that's out, and I'm like, if you touch that, I have to punish you. And they'll come along and they'll touch it, and they'll smile. It's like, I used to think my dad was a liar. And this is going to hurt me more than it hurts you. Yeah, he's not. That's not a lie. I have not said that to the children yet, because I remember thinking when I'm a kid, yeah, whatever. But that's true. The difficulty of setting down a rule, this is the rule and this is what we do, and if you violate this rule, you're going to be in trouble. The difficulty is that when that rule is violated, you have to stick to what you said was going to happen. My dad told me to be home one night at 10:30. I was home at 10:34. And I walked in, and I thought it was no big deal, and he just held his hand out. Keys. That's exactly right. He took the keys away for a month because I was 4 minutes late. 4 minutes. I was never late, ever again. Your dad did that to you? Is that no? That's what you see God doing. You see God telling, if you do this, here's the consequence. And then they do it, so here's the consequence. That's part of the covenant. It's part of the agreement. And so in everything that we see, God never violates his covenant. He never changes his nature. He never goes back on what he has promised. He never does any of those things. The one consistent thing throughout the entire Bible is God. He is the one who never moves and never changes and is always the same. And so when he tells us something, whether good or bad, you can trust that it's going to happen. It is going to come to pass because he always keeps his word. Thank you for bringing that up. Any other thoughts? All right, so verse 6, and if we need to go back, we can. Verse 6, now we're back, Joshua's alive again. And this is sort of what I mean, is this is not chronological. Because the book starts off after the death of Joshua, these things happened, and now Joshua is alive again. Joshua dismisses the people. They're going to go to all their inheritance. Then you're going to go back, right? They're supposed to be driving out those nations. They don't do it. But now we're sort of getting this is where they started. The people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great work that the Lord had done for Israel. Now at that point, there's a word that I would like us to focus on, and it's the word seen. Seeing is important throughout the whole story that we're being told, from the beginning of the Bible to the end of the Bible. Pay attention the next time you read Revelation, how many times John says, look, right? Seeing is important. In the garden, the man and the woman saw what about the tree? They saw that it was good for food, and they saw that it was desirable, and they saw all these things. And so throughout the book, here and in other places, like for example, Samson, when he meets that woman, he's going to say what? Look, there's this woman I want you to go get, this Philistine woman. And his parents are going to say, isn't there a woman amongst your own tribe, amongst your own people? And Samson says, no, she looks good to me. And I don't necessarily think he's saying, well, she's the prettiest one. I think you're getting that same idea, that same picture, going back to the garden where the man and the woman, they see the fruit, it looks good to eat, it's desirable to be like God, and Israel is going to constantly see things, and it's the choice in the garden, repeated and replayed over and over and over. I see this, I want that, it doesn't matter. And there's no consequences here. And so here, instead, this is good, right? This is the counterpoint to that. These people have seen God's glory. Just like Moses in Exodus wants to see God's glory, and he goes in front of him, and Moses looks from behind, and he sees and he hears the glory of the Lord proclaimed, the Lord that is kind and generous and merciful and shows steadfast love to generations. Right? He is seeing the Lord, and here that's what you've got. These people are seeing the great work that God has done for Israel. And this idea of seeing is important. We are those, Christians are those who have seen the glory of God in the face of Jesus. That is what we have done. And we have looked and we have seen that that is what we want. And the other choice is ever present. But that's sort of this theme that is going to run throughout. And you'll hear that repeated in the refrain that during the time of the judges there was no king and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Right. That's the key. Is what do you see? And so here, they've seen God, and so they're faithful. And they are faithful until that whole generation passes away. All right, so any thoughts or comments on that section there, verse 6 through 10? Yeah.
It shouldn't be, but it is.
It is.
And then the next generation is even worse. Because he used the ones who fell away as a standard.
Yes. That's exactly what happens. We tend to use the people before us as a standard. And so if there is a weak, a generation that moves away, for the next people coming up, that group that has moved away is going to be the new standard. And this is one of the interesting things about religious history, and I won't bore you with the Puritans, but when the Puritans come over to New England, one of the interesting things about the Puritans is watching how they walk away from who they had originally wanted to be, and it only takes a generation and a half. It's just amazing to see that they do the same thing that happens here.
But the key to it is what parents and leaders did not do.
Yep.
You want to talk about it. It's on your mouth, talking about it all the time. Because they could have seen the glory of God from what their parents told them and their leaders told them. From a child on.
Yes.
When we don't do that, the children know.
Yes. There has to be teaching. The religious word that you'll hear people toss around sometimes is catechesis, which is just instruction from the time of youth all the way up. Or when somebody is becoming, right, they're first introduced, you give them what they need to have a solid foundation. And it's a constant thing. It involves every aspect of your person. It involves every area of your life. And it is something that you do every day. In fact, sometimes people will go to school for a few years. They'll go to a catechumen school, and they'll do this throughout various times in history. But the idea is that we have to train one another how to be a disciple. It takes training. And it's something it has to be actively chosen. One of the mistakes that I often make with my kids is I let things just sort of go on cruise control. And it can be about anything. Right, about anything. And the moment you stop actively parenting, you stop actively teaching, you stop actively being engaged in something, the desired outcome degrades. It gets worse. And so we, as a local church, if we want to have the next people, the young people in the church and the people in the community who will come to know the Lord, if we want to have another generation of people, then we have to be actively engaged in that discipleship training. And it takes everybody. It takes everybody. And I think you're exactly right. Whether there was just zero interest from the young people, or there was not much teaching happening from the older people, or most likely a combination of the two, that's the problem. That is why Israel is going to wind up where they are. It's because they don't know the Lord. Yes. Yes. So the comment was that sometimes what will happen is the church is we just kind of go along and think, but things don't stay static. They're going to move, or they're going to get better, or they're going to get worse. And if we think that we can just continue on, just show up for services and just do the normal routine, and we don't actively engage, then things are going to move one way or the other. They might get better in spite of us, or they might get worse because, right? And all of this is in the context of every single person having their free will to choose. Right? Parents can do everything right. I think Samson's parents are a pretty good example of parents who are actively engaged in their kid's life. They're constantly giving him good advice, and Samson just doesn't care. Right? You can't, what can you do? You can't do it. Samuel is another example of a father who's very conscientious. He saw what happened with Eli and his sons. He's constantly teaching. He's constantly working with his kids. But when his children are older, the people of Israel are like, we don't want your kids to be in charge. Right? So with that sort of idea as the caveat, that this it's not applicable to every single individual situation, the general movement of a group is going to be positive or negative. It's not going to stay the same. And if we ever get to the point where we aren't actively working, then things are going to move. Maybe in spite of us getting better, or because of us getting worse. Yeah.
And I would argue 100% I agree with that point you just made, Steve. I would also argue along with kind of the way the Apostle Paul saw himself as being set for the defense of the gospel. Talk about it in Philippians 1 and other places. Down through history, God's people have always had a leader or leaders who are willing to stand up and defend him, defend the Lord. Not that God needs that, but there were always those who either he appointed on earth to do that. Paul was one of them, Moses, different people down through the ages. And I wonder, in fact, I'm convinced that today we have weak leaders. We have weak people in the churches. And that's why churches slide off into apostasy and even into heresy. Because we don't have people who are, they're willing to sit in the pew, but they're not willing to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. What you just taught is wrong, and here's why. If we just let sin or false teaching propagate, then what do we expect when, the entire church goes off into institutionalism or, whatever else? This is exactly what we're seeing with the Israelites here in Genesis.
Yeah. There's a leadership vacuum at the beginning. And that is important because, like it or not, we're described as sheep. And being called a lamb, as cute as they are, is not a compliment. They don't prosper without a shepherd. They have to have somebody leading them. It's just...
That's things that they Joshua dismissed them for their own inheritance and go after them. You're supposed to say, "Mom, they had leadership."
Yes, and they should have, right? You see earlier in the book how you have the heads of the tribes and the heads of the clans and the heads of the houses and all these. Those are supposed to be the people who are leading them, the leaders of the tens, of the hundreds, of the thousands. Where are those people? What are they doing? They're not doing their job. there's a need for leadership. And this is true at every level. Not everybody is going to be a leader at the level of Joshua, where you're in charge of a nation, or Moses, but there was more than that, right? There were the leaders of the thousands, of the hundreds, of the 50s, of the tens. And so there's this sense in which at every level there is someone who should be in a leadership role. And this is true whether you're male or female, right? Because in Titus 2, the older women are supposed to be training the younger women, and the older men are supposed to be training the younger men. And so there is this constant need for somebody to disciple us, for somebody to show us and teach us and train us. And when that is absent, this is the result. And so one of the things that we're going to see this repeated a lot throughout the year is that we need someone to disciple us. We need someone to work with us. Because Christianity is more than here are these, I'm just going to pick a number, right? Here are these 15 things you must believe. Yeah, there are those 15 things, and they're all theologically true. But there is the taking of those 15 truths and putting them into practice in your daily life that isn't necessarily concrete or black and white or something that's very easy to do, especially if you've never had any exposure to this before. People who become believers who don't come from a religious background, they don't know how to do Christianity. They don't know what it is, they don't know what it looks like, and they need somebody to come and show them. And that's sort of where Israel is. This new generation that is coming up, they don't know how to do, I don't know what to call it, Judaism, Hebrewism, whatever. They don't know how to do that. They need somebody to show it to them. And it doesn't happen. And so we have to keep that in mind, that we need people to disciple us. Yep. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yes. And we'll see that idea come up with the Levites as we go through the book. Okay, so picking up in verse 11, here's where, from verse 11 down to the beginning of chapter 3, so chapter 2, verse 11 down through chapter 3, you have the cycle explained to you. This is what you're going to see. And each one of the things that is outlined here, you're going to see in each one of the judge cycles. The exception is Shamgar, who, he just pokes people with a stick. And that's all you get from Shamgar. Shamgar killed 700 people with an ox goad, and that's it. But all of the other judge cycles, they follow what you see here. They follow from chapter 2, verse 11, down through chapter 3 and verse 6. There's this cycle where the people are unfaithful. Then when they're not faithful, someone is going to come, and someone is going to plunder them, and the Lord will raise up a judge. And in verse 18, whenever the Lord raises up a judge, the Lord will be with the judge, and he will save the people from the hand of their enemies all the days of the judge, because the Lord is moved by pity from their groaning and from those who afflicted and oppressed them. And so what's interesting is the writer doesn't say, God will look down and see the restored faithfulness of the people and responds to their restored faith. That's not what it says. It says God will look down and see how bad things are, and he will show pity on them because of how bad things are. And when he does that, then the people will respond in faith. They will come back. Right? And they will be faithful during the days of the judge. But whenever the judge dies, in verse 19, they're going to turn back and they're going to become more corrupt than their fathers. So that's the cycle. Right? They're going to get worse, and then they're not going to come back all the way, to the point where it's almost irretrievably gone. Very much like when Manasseh repents, it's too late. It's good that Manasseh repents, but the sins are too great. The sins of the nations have become too great. The Babylonians are coming. It doesn't matter anymore. And that is sort of what you're going to see happen through this story. So then the anger of the Lord is going to burn. The people are going to be, God is no longer going to drive out the nations, and then you're going to have the cycle repeat. And chapter 3 starts with this interesting statement. Now these are the nations that the Lord left to test Israel by them. That is, in all in Israel who had not experienced all the wars in Canaan. It was only in order that the generation of people of Israel might know war, to teach war to those who had not known it before. And these are the nations. And he's going to list 5 nations. And there's one that doesn't get listed. It's the first one with Othniel. But what does that mean? That these nations are left to test Israel? Yeah. Yeah. He's constantly trying to bring them back. That's the purpose of the judges, is to come and deliver the people and to create a contrast so that there's actually a choice. And to bring the people back, to bring the knowledge of God back to the people, in a sense, to create a choice.
Doesn't it also mean that back in chapter 2, verse 3, when we talk about the nations becoming thorns and their gods will become a snare as well? So it sounds like it's kind of wording that.
Yeah, it is. And this is ultimately the test for the people of Israel. If you go back to Deuteronomy 13, I think we've mentioned this before, I used to tell people when they claimed to be able to do miraculous things, I would say things like, well, just raise somebody from the dead and I'll believe you. Or just, I'll tell you what, Romanian. Say something in Romanian and I'll believe that you can speak. I used to say things like that. Well, what if they did? What if they brought somebody back from the dead? What if they started speaking Romanian or Georgian, and not like Georgia the state, but Georgia the country, right? What if they did that? What if they started speaking in some crazy language? Are you now supposed to listen to them no matter what? This is where everybody goes, no. What are you going to say? Yes. Yes. And that's what Deuteronomy 13, 1 through 5 says. It doesn't matter if somebody comes and does these amazing signs or wonders. If they perform some kind of sign or wonder and then say, let's go follow other gods, you don't listen to them. Because ultimately what it comes down to is this idea of faithfulness only to God and faithfulness to what God has told you. And if anybody ever comes and tries to take you to some other god, it doesn't matter what magic they can perform. You don't listen. And so at the end of the day, I think that's exactly what you're seeing here. There's all these nations, there's all these gods, there's all these things that are going to happen. And the question at the end of the day is, who do you put your trust in? Are you putting your trust in God, or are you putting your trust in what you can see? Are you putting your trust in what God has said, or the way things appear to you? Right? And that's the test. Right? That's the garden, all over again. Yes?
It's just a reoccurring cycle of apostasy, oppression, distress, and deliverance over and over.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, here's a thought question. We've talked about something kind of like this on many occasions. But here it very clearly says that God did these things to test them. Does God still test us in ways like this? Because I know that we have, had conversations where, well, temptation really comes from the devil. And it says testing, but testing is a form of temptation. So I guess that would be my question. How does God test us on a daily basis? Because we serve the same God daily. He has not changed. We know he never does. So I wonder about that.
Look at that. Out of time. My short answer is yes. I do think, just like I think like in Hebrews chapter 12, I think we're still chastised. I think God is active. I don't think he's the passive deist God who sort of wound the watch and now he just lets it go. The difficulty is I don't know when God is doing what. Because, go ahead. Yeah.
do other things to cause us ire. To me, that's the next question is our point regarding what we need to learn from this.
Yes.
We've got to trust God. We've got to rely on Him and not be taken over by our culture. It's so easy to do, as you pointed out earlier.
Yes.
This is the ongoing story of Israel. They're trapped in between these great powers. I mean, who do you trust? Do you trust God or the
Yeah.
powers around you?
Yeah. This is
Now,
this.
we're trying to make it last, if you see the story go on.
Yeah. Israel's constantly going to find themselves in these tight situations, and the question is going to be continually, who do you trust? Are you putting your trust in what you can see, or are you going to put your trust in God? And it's the same thing today. And we don't really have time to get into it, but we will once we get down to the discussion with Othniel about it, like nations and the rise and fall of nations and conflict and warfare, and how the Bible doesn't view those things as just the happenstances of history. The Bible views those things as God being very active in human history and using nations and rulers to bring about exactly what he wants to happen. And so, yeah, I think we do need to sort of adjust the way that we think and stop, sort of trying to explain the universe with only the things that we can see. Because there is this divine being who is unimaginably powerful, who is active, that you can't see. And so who are we going to trust? And we are really out of time now. One more. Yes. And that's an important point. Yes. Did everybody hear? Okay, good. Because that is the point, right? Ultimately in the book, that nevertheless, despite their behavior, God sends them judges. Just like in the New Testament, despite the fact that we're God's enemies, he sends his son to save us. And that absolutely is the crux of what we're looking at here. Okay, thank you very much. We'll pick up next time in chapter 3 with Othniel, and we're going to get into the judges.